Now that we have all the housekeeping stuff out of the way, we have everything installed, we've gone over a high-level overview of what Android is, now we're ready to actually create our first project. So you're going to want to launch up Eclipse, and once it's launched, we don't want to create the project. It's a lot slower to create it through the traditional Android way to create projects here. We just want to use this toolbar button that says Open a Wizard to help create a new Android project. And this launches this window. So the first thing we're going to need is a project name. Now this project name is just the name of how it's going to be stored on your hard drive. This is not how the end user is going to see your application. So I'm just going to call it My First App. We're going to want to create a new project in the workspace. And by default, it's going to use that location that we chose. Now, if I wanted to change that, I can uncheck it and browse to something, but we're going to use that default location. Now, remember when we downloaded the samples for the SDK, if we wanted to base our project off of one of those samples, we can do that by selecting this. And now we can see all of the API samples that we can choose from. We're not going to do that here. So let me go up and we're going to choose Create a New Project in Workspace. So for build target, remember that I told you if you had the time to download all of the SDK versions. Now, I only downloaded the Gingerbread version, so obviously I'm going to check that off. It's the only one I have. But generally speaking, the way in which you build Android applications is you want to target the lowest API level possible. Because if I'm not using any Gingerbread features, I don't want to target Gingerbread because all of those people with Froyo and with Eclair are not going to be able to get my application, even though it runs fine on their devices. So, in this case, I'm just going to choose Gingerbread. And you can see it's pre-populated here when I chose that sample. So I'm going to get rid of this. Application name, I'm going to call it My First App. Now, this is the actual application name for what the user is going to see when they download your application. Now, for a package name, again, you usually use your reverse domain name thing. So com Lee Brimlow, and I'll call it First App. So we're going to want to create an activity because, again, almost every application is going to want to have at least one activity or one screen that the user sees. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to call it main. When I build applications, generally when I'm starting is the main activity that launches when the user opens the app, I just call it main. Again, we can change this later. It's not a big deal. So for minimum SDK version, here we can put in which SDK version we want to target. And you can see already you have a warning up here. The API level for the selected SDK target does not match the minimum SDK version. So we're not going to worry about this. And in fact, I'm just going to change it to 10. So I'm going to be targeting Gingerbread as the minimum SDK version. Because in this course, we may be using Gingerbread specific features. But again, just so you know, the best practice is to target the lowest one possible. But since we're only dealing with one, I'm going to put in 10. If I click Next here we can create a test project. This is a project in which we can do automated tests using JUnit, which we're not going to cover in this course. So I'm just going to click Finish. And this is going to create our project. So now we can see it here in the Package Explorer. It looks like there's an error. Android just needs to take a minute just to kind of set itself up, and that should go away. You can see already it's gone away. So now if we look in the source folder, inside of my package, I have the main.java file. And this is the main Java file for my activity. And we can see that it actually extends activity. Now we can respond to a whole slew of different override methods here. Things like onCreate, which is being responded to here. But like I mentioned before, we have onStart, onPause. We can respond to any of these different things to react to different changes in the life cycle of this activity. But onCreate is the one that's required. And we can see all that's happening in this onCreate is first, it calls the super onCreate method. So super.onCreate. But then it calls this setContentView method. So again, this activity right here doesn't have any user interface until we say setContentView. And it's actually referencing a XML file called main. So where is that file? Well, it's actually in the resources folder. And we're going to go through these in much greater depth in future movies in this course. But if we look in the layout folder, we can see this main.xml file. So let's double click that. And you'll notice here that we have a visual editor. So this is actually an editor in which we can drag and drop different controls or views onto our activity. We can also go directly to the XML view. If we click this, we can see just a simple XML representation. And this is how our user interfaces are built. So we have a top-level layout called linear layout, and this actually lays out objects in a linear fashion. And then we just have a single text view inside of here. So we can see by default when we create a project, it's created a full working Hello World application for us. So now again, we're going to be going into a lot of detail in future movies. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is to run this application to see what it looks like on the emulator. So I'm just going to go up to this green button here, and we can see we're going to click this to actually run it. So when I click it the first time, it's going to ask me, how do I want to run this application? Well, obviously I want to run it as an Android application. So I'm going to click that and click OK. And now if I go to the emulator, we should see it in a second. So now it's actually installing it here. There it is. It's run. We have my first app, again, which is the title that I gave. And we have that text view that says Hello World. So we've now successfully installed this on the emulator. And if I actually go back to the home screen, go into my app drawer, we can see that I have the My First app here installed. And this will remain installed, again, until I specifically say wipe user data, or I uninstall it here in the emulator. For the default project, again, there's two pieces. We have our main.java file, which extends activity. And in the onCreate, it's simply setting the content view to the contents of this XML file, which is, again, our UI, which has a linear layout with a text view inside. But now let's look at some of the other folders here and other things that are inside of this project. So we have our source folder, which is where all our Java files are going to live. Then we have this gen folder. Now this is somewhere you don't really want to ever go into because they're generated by the tools and they're not something that you're supposed to mess with. But we're going to be really careful here. We're just going to open up this r.java file. So now what happens here, as we add resources to our project, which live in this res folder, Android is going to automatically put an entry here in this r.java file with the name of the resource and then a number value in which it's going to refer to that in your project. So we can see that the main.xml is being actually internally referred to with this number. You don't have to worry about this, but just letting you know that it's there. So you don't want to go into this folder. Now we see this Android 2.3.3, and this is the actual Android SDK. So we can twirl down this android.jar file and see all of the packages, classes, and assets that are actually inside of the Android SDK. Now, typically, you're not going to want to go in there, but that's what's in that folder. Now we have an assets folder, and we'll talk about this in a later movie, what this is for. Then we have our res folder, which is short for resources. And again, this is where we're going to have all of our images. And you can see here we have our app icon, which is just the default now. All of our XML layouts, which are UIs, are going to live in the layout folder. Values, this is where we have different things such as string values, which is particularly important if we want to localize text to have strings separated out into XML files. Then you can see we have our Android manifest.xml. So if we click this, we're going to go into more details in a later movie on this as well, but we have basically a visual editor which we can go through and edit the various properties of that XML file. Or we can just simply do it directly in XML view. And again, this is the XML file that describes your application to the Android system. And the final two files, default properties, progrod.cfg, you're not going to have to worry about those. So that's the basic project structure of a simple Android application.